Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And I'm gonna say it, this week feels kind of heavy. Not just that I said a lot and I've had some equipment issues, but we've got some hefty albums to parse through. I mean, at least it feels like I'm getting close to getting back on schedule here, so alright, let's get on the pulse. So we've got 8 albums on the docket. Let's start off with, from the Reticent, the Oubliette. This is a progressive metal act that's been on my schedule for a bit, a one-man project that's been active for over a decade in the underground, that started off very acoustic and pretty much started getting the Opeth comparisons immediately when they added more metal elements, at least in terms of some of the guitar tones and the atmosphere, and some of the less melodramatic content, if not the majority of the clean singing. And I mention the content because while I would argue On the Eve of a Goodbye from 2016 is a pretty good album, digging into the concept and some of the themes, I'm not sure it really lands for me. Which takes us to the Oubliette, where both the sound and the thematic intensity have been kicked up a considerable notch, this time exploring the heartbreaking and genuinely horrifying case of losing one's memory and grasp on reality that can come with dementia or Alzheimer's, which leads to difficult and painful questions surrounding how one treats their elders in a world with an aging population, and with the question of euthanasia subtly in frame. Let me make this clear. For as much as I would argue that this album actually pivots away from some of the melodrama that kinda put me off that last album, this is a punishingly bleak project, no matter how you slice it. A pretty long listen through 7 tracks over an hour that don't pull any punches, and work to emphasize the morally complicated trauma implicit in an experience like this, not just in the grief of unrecognized family, but also how the loss of memory and thought can make you feel like you're being trapped and forgotten inside your own head, especially with past loved ones seeming just out of your reach from your perception. This is not a story with happy endings, not a shred of relief, and what could be a horrifying reality for too many people set to face it as they or their relatives age. Ergo, it's not an album I ever want to hear again, because I'm also not sure the execution does these themes justice. See, that's the complicated thing about this album. If you're looking to sell something so hopelessly draining and real with no catharsis, pairing it with not particularly gripping or distinctive death-leaning prog metal that almost seems to emphasize the mundane with some pretty colorless guitar work and chilly keyboards and clean vocals, of which, let's be honest, I never thought were all that gripping. It's a bit of a weird fit, especially when you get a few too many obvious technical flourishes in the guitar solos or some odd percussion diversions. Now, this was not a case where I expected this to have hooks or be any sort of fun. It's a wallow in a singular, utterly dreary and hopeless scene, all the more painful for its normalcy. But I'll say this, in art like this, there's normally a transcendent emotional resonance that comes through the experience, whereas this falls kind of flat for me. I wouldn't compare it to Caligula by Lingua Ignota and how the rawness translated to catharsis so much, more like The Terror by the Flaming Lips, or maybe that Caretaker project, the implacable feeling of what living without love will lead to a horrifyingly bleak experience. But those projects nailed the atmosphere so effectively and so strongly, whereas this feels awkwardly flat, kind of pedestrian even if that was the point. If anything, it reminds me of my response to A Crow Looked at Me by Mount Eerie, where I got the sadness intellectually, but emotionally I just wasn't connecting to it, consciously or otherwise. And I'll say it, Phil Elverum is a much more detailed and interesting writer than the very plain-spoken style that we got here. Now, all that being said, I can't deny for this very singular objective, it does what it's designed to do, and if you've got any personal connection to scenes like this, I can see it as an utterly devastating listen, especially by the tragedy of its ending. There's gonna be a real audience for this. It's just not me, so a strong 6 out of 10. Be prepared going in for a really hard listen, because, you're gonna get one. Next up, from Left at London, Transgender Street Legend, Volume 2.
Dressed in a face mask and walk on the beach till my feet hurt.
So this is another one of those cases where I've been aware of Left at London for some time. If you follow the very online queer music scene, her name does tend to come up, but I just haven't had the chance to cover one of her EPs just yet, with this being the sequel to her project in 2018. Now, that EP was taking some of her art pop stylings into more fractured and jagged folk territory, and while I will say the production had a ways to go, the compositions were getting pretty sharp, and I was not going to complain about a surprise verse from Open Mike Eagle of all people. Now, this album does not have that immediate standout surprise, and I'd also say it's got a very different feel than even the first album. More mainstream adjacent trap elements, the mixing and the vocal delivery are intentionally a little rougher around the edges, with a blend of guitars and some auto-tune that feels very online, or very Brockhampton, come to think of it, especially on the second half of the EP. And a lot of the anxious instability, it definitely comes through in both the writing and the vocals, circling the frail desperation that comes with battling dissociative disorder, a lot of suicidal ideation, breakdowns of intimacy, and a desperate desire to find any sort of comfort in the real world, especially when the larger established systems continue to fail you. It definitely exposes a lot more raw, discomforting edges, and yet I will say it's also one of those projects where I feel like the execution falls into some oddly flat territory, where the tones seem to imply more danger and an edge than the delivery effectively backs up, particularly in the synth choices that can feel kind of tinny and lacking some of that foundational body in order to match with the guitars. But honestly, some of my disconnect, it might actually circle around and surround how that genreless, very online sound that you get from acts like Left at London or Glass Beach or even Brockhampton can just be a little bit hit and miss with me in terms of what tones hit resonance, especially when it can feel intentionally rough around the edges, as this does. That being said, dig past that, the songcraft is solid, so light 7 out of 10. It's good. I imagine for other audiences, this will hit way more strongly, so check it out. Next up, from Svalbard, When I Die, Will I Get Better? Okay, so we actually have a decent amount of screamo / post-hardcore this week, so let's start off with this UK band, and actually flirts with some black metal textures for a more primal but soaring approach. And well, while I won't always say the production got there in their earlier projects, it can feel a little flat in patches, there was a visceral potency to a lot of the melodies, and some surprisingly sharp writing provided you could parse through the screams, so I was definitely curious about this new album. And wow, what a step up! Folks, a project like this is the biggest evidence possible of what great producers can bring to an album, because the sound is pretty much in the same wheelhouse, but not only do the guitars and the bass textures feel so much bigger and sharper, there's a richness and melodic swell to this mix backing up the tremolo riff passages. It almost reminds me of atmospheric black metal in spots, and that is high praise for how striking that balance between visceral and beautiful can really be. No joke, it's almost difficult for me to describe the cool, raw purity of these swells of riffs that drive the crescendos, but unlike so much atmospheric black metal, they support some actual hooks and the throat-shredding delivery in that balance from Serena Cherry, between the ethereal huskiness for the echoing post-rock passages and the raw screams that can go toe-to-toe with anyone in black metal, or the addition of Liam Phelan's gruff bark on Silent Restraint. It's all the more potent. I mean, I'm not always the craziest about a few of the hardcore passages, but that's a really minor complaint. There's not many of them. And you know, this is also one of those cases where I think they probably could have gotten by on texture and soaring power alone. There's not much to say beyond, oh my god, it's awesome. But then you get to the content. Because thematically, this is an album wrenching to expose its rawest emotions and truths, bucking not just against the systems that would marginalize women based off of appearance or clickbait narratives that would strip away further agency, but also the trauma that comes through abusive relationships and the lingering, isolating blanket of depression and trying to reach people beyond that. And yeah, it's raw and direct to a fault. Absolutely Riot Girl in spirit, if not traditional sound. But if you're looking to claim claim or reclaim your agency and your own self-worth, sometimes the most straightforward statements can hit with the most power. And that's not to deny the fact there's actually some real nuance to the poetry of Listen to Someone or Pearlescent. In other words, you know what, before this year, I couldn't imagine myself saying this about a screamo project, even one that leans towards black metal, but it's easily one of the most affecting and potent pieces I have heard all year, coming even sharper under 40 minutes to boot, so 9 out of 10. Powerful stuff, y'all need to hear it. Next up from Neil Cicierega, Mouth Dream.
It's all relative to the size of your steamboat. You can't see the forest full of trees, and you can't smell your own knees.
Honestly, just a matter of time. Now, for those of you who have spent way too much time online, Neil Cicierega's mouth mashup albums are widely beloved for their wild combinations drilling into a certain nostalgic heresy that comes with smashing popular songs together and seeing what sort of mad genius comes out of it. Now, I'm of the opinion that good mashups can pop up fairly regularly, but truly excellent, the transcendent ones, they require something special beyond just novelty. Patricia Taxon's best examples from Punk and Victory Lap will spring to mind for me, the former being an extended examination of copyright that is way too much mad genius to be ignored, and you know what, by that metric, I would also put Cicierega above an act like, say, Girl Talk in terms of imagination and flair, but his record can be a bit spotty. Mouth Moods was probably the first moment where it felt like less extended meme and more defined songs, so I did have expectations this would proceed in that direction, and that might have been a mistake, because this absolutely feels like a step back that is neither as awesomely mimetic nor as strongly constructed as Cicierega's best work. And you know what, I'm gonna have to start with the biggest unspoken observation about a lot of Cicierega's mashups. The production, it's about as basic as it comes, where the synchronization can, mostly, be counted on to be pretty solid, but expecting any sort of greater blending or attempt to better align the cadence or the flow of the song outside of chopping up the lyrics down for a quick absurdist meme, and you might be left kind of wanting. I mean, it's been an issue I've had with his mashups for years now because the layering is just kind of clunky, and this is the massive risk which comes with pushing an admittedly pretty good gimmick a little bit too long. Novelty eventually starts wearing kind of thin, especially when the songs are going to run long and you can start predicting the joke, or after including just the instrumental from one track in your mashup, they'll throw the vocals into the very next mashup, which doesn't guarantee great sequencing, and it starts to be a little less clever than he thinks it is, and I'm left asking, alright, what more does this add up to? And again, the results are kind of spotty. The general themes loosely circle around dreams and sleep iconography, where the nightmares are only just a matter of time. But from there, well, the flip of Johnny Cash and Justin Bieber into Just a Baby, that was kind of inspired. Slamming Edwin Starr and Spice Girls into a Wario tribute, that's a great meme. Pairing Britney Spears with Beethoven just makes perfect sense for their equivalent stature in pop culture. And hell, Ribs might have even more levels of twisted depth and imagination than even Cicierega intended. And I'll admit, I had way more fun than I should have with Amoré. I mean, it just hit the critical stupidity threshold for me where it spun around and become awesome. It's something that the pairing of Fred Durst with Peter Gabriel didn't come close to breaking through, I should mention. But you know what? The song that sticks out the most here might be Cannibals, which tries to use a bunch of film bumper music to give She Drives Me Crazy by the Fine Young Cannibals a little bit of that terrifying punch in an analogous way that is inspired flip of YMCA hit on Mouth Moods. But to me, it might be more revealing of how that song actually had an emotional recontextualization that went beyond the flip and the stylism. And when this album doesn't hit that, it does feel kind of weirdly hollow, which might be the reason why mashing together the earnestness of Fireflies into the instrumental of Nine Inch Nails' Closer only dampens them both. In short, even though I had some pretty low expectations for this, it felt like a bit of a wonky letdown, which might be an apt way to describe meme culture, come to think of it, so you might get what you want. Strong 5 out of 10. Man, I want to like this more. Next up, from Laura Jane Grace, Stay Alive.
All my bridges burned and my friends are enemies. Feels like there's always gonna be something that I'm missing.
The last time I talked about a Lauren Jane Grace in a quick review was with that 2018 project with the Devouring Mothers, which I actually liked a fair bit when it came to the writing and the delivery, but the presentation left me a little cold. Not that it was bad, but the more stripped back, acoustic-leaning sound didn't really match or complement the flair of her writing all that much, which is why this solo side venture did concern me a little bit, especially with most of the tracks hovering around the 2-minute mark, and, well, look, it feels like a side venture, specifically reminding me of that lo-fi experiment that John Darnielle released in the middle of quarantine, where you can tell that Laura Jane Grace was working with what she had to streamline something together, which is kind of some cheap-sounding drum machines and all. Look, I know putting together a percussion setup on your own, programmed or otherwise, it is way harder than so many will give credit, even if you actually have Steve Albini, of all people, providing his spare but clinical touch to a lot of the detail and mix. Probably the reason why the percussion even sounds close to passable, but still kind of more distracting than good, especially when the bass compositions, they really could have all stayed acoustic or with hand percussion, and that might have sounded better. Would have been fine by me. But what caught me off guard from Laura Jane Grace, not just that the acoustic sound worked for her this time around, but that once you start digging into the content, there's still that dark, sharply visceral sense of wistful detail. Why can't I be with you? That's a nice subtle touch there, especially given the philosopher she's referencing. But there's an undercurrent of desperate hope that slips through a lot more often than you would expect, especially given all those nihilistic elements that were pretty consistent the last time. Now, this only feels like the death of everything. That's a statement on the first song, but that's just it. It's a feeling, and somehow she's gonna power through it, be it through more than a few references to Oz and chemical escapism, a few welcome middle fingers at the current POS-in-chief who failed the United States, or just facing the brutal reality and pacing forward, or just in bored, smoldering circles around your apartment while you're in quarantine. Now, that being said, even for its relatively short length, it does meander in some odd places. What you would expect out of bored moments of dreaming, I get it. And I will say I've only got a few obvious standouts, like the Mountain Song, finally getting a proper version of Hanging Tree, and definitely the earnest final cut, Old Friends Stay Alive. But I'm also not gonna lie and say this had some understated power that did stick with me. Maybe it's just the time, so light 7 out of 10. If you're curious, this is worth hearing. Next up from Future Islands, As Long As I'm kind of surprised we haven't had the Future Islands discussion before now, but truth be told, I can cite them as having a similar critical trajectory to Everything Everything, an indie-leaning, warped approach to rock music with some odd synth choices, and a frontman whose voice is distinctly an acquired taste, who caught fire in the mid-2010s with what many would describe as a slightly more accessible or dynamic version of their regular sound, where the critics absolutely lost their shit over the group, and then the buzz seemed to evaporate for the next couple of projects, despite the sound not really changing all that much. Now, granted, that sudden burst of attention here, it was likely due to the 4AD signing, and I'd argue I clicked with Future Islands a lot more quickly. Samuel Herring's haggard rasp, it's weird, but in a kind of charming way. Their grooves and hooks can have such a distinctively cool texture, and once you make out the lyrics, the writing can be pretty damn layered. Now, granted, since they signed to 4AD, the production definitely lost some of that depth and flavor of some more conventional new wave, and I would not really say that 2017 project really left off the page for me, even if the grooves were again pretty great. But in 2020, well, I was inclined to say it's just another 4AD Future Islands album, but that's also not quite what we have here. If anything, it's a further push down the path of their 2017 project towards more glossy, synth-laden production production that I might even call modern synthwave if it came from any other band, except it's just kind of jarring that Future Islands is falling into that retro bubble almost organically and naturally. Now, the more exasperating problem for me is that it falls into the background a lot faster than you would like, with only a few bursts of light in the synth work that call back to when Seasons blew everybody's mind. You would think the band would want to drill into that magic again and again instead of stripping away more texture and verve to sound increasingly anonymous in a populated sound. With the grooves still being pretty good, the tones are agreeable, but there's nothing really explosive, which makes the album's thicker post-punk grooves and reverbed mix feel slower and drearier than it actually is. And when you actually dig into the content, you can argue that kind of makes sense. It's an album about dealing with old trauma and moving on, bad relationships and depression from your past, and trying to open yourself up to loving yourself and then being loved by others. And there is a value in that arc being a little bit more quiet and meditative. But there's also some odd tangents here that don't really click. The Painter is a song about race and trying to convince people to see the value of all colors, really wake up. It feels so limp and faded in its approach that I don't think it's going to reach people. More jarring is a song where the ex says our frontman poisoned her life because she cheated and he put it to music, and that has lingered beyond just the breakup. And it does raise an interesting implication about how processing emotions through your art that you release commercially can have side effects for those caught in its midst, especially if it becomes popular. But I also think he kind of missed the meta text that by making a song about this scene, he did it all again, and then he seems to absolve himself of any sort of culpability or responsibility. I don't know. It's an album that feels oddly complacent in a lot of its introspection. A lot of healing, but without really getting to the raw roots of it all, and that's kind of mirrored in the execution, but also be why I'm kind of lukewarm at this at best. So a few good songs, overall not great, 6 out of 10, only for the fans. Next up from Touché Amoré, Lament. This is one of those bands that the second I started getting into more post-hardcore and being more tolerant of screamo, I knew they would wind up on my radar. Frankly, I'm surprised it took me this long to get to them, but I think my rationale, not much time on my schedule, it's kind of different than what might drive away some audiences, which is just how raw and shredded the vocals could sound opposite a more tuneful, or dare I even say accessible, melodic foundation, which only slowed and deepened with every successive album. They often get grouped along with La Dispute in discussion thanks to their raw, very personal subject matter, and I'm not always sure that's apt. La Dispute dabble with off-kilter, huge-sounding post-rock and spoken word, and Touché Amoré is far more immediate and accessible in their hooks by at least the standards of post-hardcore. They hit a pretty great high point with Stage 4 2016, and I did hear that this would be an expansion upon that sound and approach, and you know what? It absolutely is, but in a way I did not expect, and that this might be their most catchy and accessible album in recent memory. Now, granted, some of that just might be for me. When you've taken a more liquid, post-hardcore tone and then added an influx of country-adjacent pedal steel, and somehow it's a naturalistic fit, or you got such well-defined bass lines that you can interject a dub-sounding passage into a song near the end, and it also somehow works, you struck a certain type of gold. I'll give them a lot of respect there. But what, even beyond that, what grabbed me on Lament is the same sense of focus on recovery and healing in a world where everything is set to compromise that, but it's also got that sort of raw, desperate urgency that can see the light on the horizon and can cherish those in his life that have helped him against all odds to actually get there. Somehow I have to say, Future Islands, you need to take notes here. It falls in similar territory as Spanish love songs, but somehow even more manic and charged in the internal journey to appreciate all the fragile beauties of love along the way. And while I don't quite think this album is as quite as cutting or detailed, and despite some great bass lines, the drum mixing doesn't always have the punch it really should to match up with the guitar work and the vocals, which are more prominent, and I think I'm just gonna blame their long-running metal producer Ross Robinson for that, even if, for the most part, he does a really great job. But this is the follow-through to Stage 4 that shows shows the remnants of that trauma lingering, but there is a path towards healing, no matter who he's got to air out and long to expose it, and all too aware of the consequences of doing so. And thus, yeah, you know what? This is legit great post-hardcore. Maybe not quite as mind-blowing or stunning as my small but growing list of favorites in the subgenre, but I can see this really sticking for a lot of audiences this year, especially if you like this more than I do. So, strong 8 out of 10. Check it out. And finally, from Brothers Osborne, Skeleton. The best way to describe my experience with this country duo on their first 2 albums is sidestepping greatness. I thought their first album was pretty good. It showed a ton of promise, a lot of creativity, but instead of stepping up to really nail it on their sophomore album, they opted for a more lethargic, hazy project that still had a lot of good, but didn't feel like that step forward in which I know they're capable. Now, 2 years later, where it seems like some of that up-and-coming buzz is cooling off, where is this gonna land? Well, honestly, it feels like a bit of another lateral move, but not one as driven by Brothers Osborne themselves as it does feel like their producer, Jay Joyce. And what's so exasperating here is that this is an album that emphasizes and embraces the oversold, unsubtle clunkiness that have characterized his groove sections, presumably on the thought that, hey, it worked for Miranda Lambert and Ashley McBryde, so leaning even heavier on it for a more rock-leaning project, that would be smart. Unaware that pushing such obviously inorganic tones were some of the most glaring factors that have held a lot of his work back in recent years. I don't know why the alchemy behind Eric Church's Mr. Misunderstood is so damn hard to recapture in terms of production balance. It would have been ideal here, but again, it just feels kind of wonky in these blocky attempts at southern fried funk that aren't as organic or really groovy as they could or should be. Now, in a way, this is a pivot that does make sense for Brothers Osborne making their arena rock album, which is promotion I think is both more and less true than it actually is. It's certainly got a lot of the bombast, and the content is mostly defaulting to some general swaggering party jams that really wish they had the punch or originality of It Ain't My Fault, but it is way more country in a lot of the song structures and lyrical detail, specifically in some of the Nashville list-driven songwriting. But you know what? Even that can lead to some good songs. Yeah, as much as I'm going to complain about the production as I'm wont to do, it's more because the foundation here of warm, organic country rock with a good baritone at lead that at least tries to be populous and fun, glaring right at you, Jason Aldean, that's a foundation that works. And there are touches like the accordion on I'm Not For Everyone, the bluesy jam of the title track Skeletons, the disastrous but kind of charming rollick of the barroom relapse on Back on the Bottle, how they managed to cram in a killer instrumental jam with Muskrat Green that just sounded phenomenal. Even the production didn't bother me there. And even the understated tribute to their dad on Old Man's Boots, that was really well done. Now, granted, a project like this loses momentum by the end, and the whole let's just love everyone sentiment feels really simplistic and clunky in 2020 of all times. But it once again highlights how Brothers Osborne are falling short of their potential yet again. And if I'm making a comparison to their previous albums, this might be their weakest. Don't get me wrong, it's still good, it's generally fun, and I'm not going to complain that much about it. But again, it's missing those high points that showed so much potential on their first 2 projects. So yeah, I'm saying a very strong 6 out of 10. I'm really getting tired of saying that this should be better. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Again, some of these are going to be a little heavy, so leave it down in the comments below. I can imagine I may have annoyed some of you. Happy to have your engagement. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or get an album on my schedule, link to my Patreon right over there. Please, again, don't feel any obligation to do so. Times are tough for everybody, I understand, but if you want to, options available. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.